Super Mario Galaxy 2 is a prime example of how confusing it can be to pick through the credits of a Nintendo game trying to figure out who did what. If you look at the Wikipedia pages for Galaxy and its sequel, you might notice that Yoshiaki Koizumi went from being both the director and lead designer for Galaxy to just one of two producers in Galaxy 2, and conclude that he was significantly less important to the creation of Galaxy 2. That would be correct. You might also notice that Koichi Hayashida, the director of Galaxy 2, is not even mentioned in the blurb for Galaxy, which would make you think that maybe he wasn't hired until late in Galaxy's development, or that Nintendo took a big gamble letting him oversee Galaxy 2. That would be wrong. Hayashida has worked at Nintendo since the 1990s, and he was the lead level designer for Galaxy. But most crucially, Shigeru Miyamoto's name is absent from the credits for Super Mario Galaxy 2, which might mislead you into thinking that this was one of those projects he didn't have much involvement in. And that would be the farthest possible thing from the truth. Miyamoto exerted a huge influence on the development of this game. In fact, if it hadn't been for his persistence, Super Mario Galaxy 2 would never have existed at all. If there's one thing I do know about the people who worked on this game, it's that at the tail end of 2007, after the release of Super Mario Galaxy, they were majorly burned out. Galaxy had incorporated a lot of crazy ideas, some of which were initially opposed by members of the team, including future Galaxy 2 director Hayashida. Galaxy had been fun to make, but it was also a lot of work, and had used up most of the ideas that they had for this kind of gameplay. They didn't want to jump right into making more galaxies for Mario to bounce around in. They didn't even want to hear the word galaxy. They wanted to move on to something new. But there was one thing standing in the way of that: their boss. You know, because Shigeru Miyamoto has often expressed his opposition to emphasizing story details and lore in Nintendo games, a lot of people have forgotten that he was the driving force behind the creation of Majora's Mask, a Zelda game that seems to embody all those things that he considers unnecessary. Now, it turned out that way partly because of Yoshiaki Koizumi's constant effort to sneak story in under his nose. But the only reason Koizumi had an excuse to do that was because of Miyamoto's push to reuse existing assets. Their relationship was never antagonistic. It was just that each wanted Nintendo's games to be great in a way that conflicted with the other's vision. Compromise between different visions has been present in the design of Mario, at least since Super Mario Bros. 3, which traded hardcore challenge for a more general goal of being fun. You could see that as a clash between the visions of Shigeru Miyamoto and Takashi Tezuka. And this spirit of compromise is not only present in, but essential to Super Mario Galaxy 2. The way this game began development is that Miyamoto took most of the people who had made Galaxy, sat them down in a conference room, and asked them to brainstorm ideas for new galaxies. At first, progress was slow. Koichi Hayashida and lead designer Kenta Motokura in particular felt like they just couldn't think of anything. But one team member who was enthusiastic about the project was Takeshi Hayakawa, the head programmer. Hayakawa came up with two ideas that arguably saved the project in its early stages. First, he resurrected an idea from Koizumi's 5-year-old pitch for the original Galaxy of having Yoshi show up in space with new abilities, which energized the team and spurred people into contributing more new ideas. Incidentally, Starship Mario is another concept from Koizumi's original prototype for Galaxy. He wanted a big planet shaped like a head to show up somewhere in the game. More importantly, Hayakawa and his team were able to create a user-friendly level editor that the designers could use to make their own level prototypes, without the programmers even having to get involved until the design was practically finished. This was something that designers on the Mario team had never had access to before, and the response to it was overwhelmingly positive. Emphasis on the overwhelming part. Whereas a few months before, the team apparently didn't have any ideas, now everyone was throwing around new Galaxy concepts like crazy. Hayashida mentioned in an interview that at one point, brainstorming sessions kept running over time because people simply did not want to leave the room. Programmers were making levels, artists were making levels. For all I know, the sanitation crew was sneaking in at night and making levels. You have to remember that the original Galaxy was already a pretty crazy game in terms of its visual and mechanical identity. The general spacey vibe and the unique but usually consistent physics can distract you from the sheer weirdness of what you're actually doing in each level. We're talking about a game where the new power-ups turned Mario into a bee, a ghost, and a spring. So when you take the people who came up with these ideas and tell them that they're going to spend a game's entire development cycle doing almost nothing but level design, you're going to end up with lots of weird levels. More or less the same thing had already happened with Majora's Mask. Ironically, it was all a little too much for Miyamoto, who had touched off this firestorm of creativity in the first place. He describes a meeting he had with Takashi Tezuka and longtime Mario programmer Toshihiko Nakago, in which they ultimately decided that the project was going in the wrong direction. It was too excessive, too encyclopedic. It lacked the resonance and the sense of unity present in most previous Mario games. He was particularly annoyed that the team was developing lots of cutscenes and new story elements, when he thought that everyone agreed that Super Mario Galaxy had already had a bit too much story. So he had a talk with Yoshiaki Koizumi, which reportedly lasted about 4 or 5 hours. And then Koizumi, who was more closely overseeing the designer's work, had a talk with them, the result of which was that most of the new story elements were scrapped. The funny thing in retrospect is that Miyamoto talks about this incident as if he got everything he wanted out of the discussion and managed to get Super Mario Galaxy 2 back under control, when it seems to me more like the only thing the team cut back on was story. The level design and mechanics of this game as a finished product still feel all over the place. They're still out of control and incoherent. It's just that now there's no story to, well, let's be honest, pretend to tie them together, the way the story in the first Galaxy did. The result is a game with a rewarding and addictive gameplay loop, a wide variety of challenges ranging from brain-dead simple to tooth-grindingly taxing, and dozens of fun and charming levels to play through. Yet it is, at the same time, one of the most disappointing and frustrating Mario games I've ever played. The immediate impression that I got from the opening of Super Mario Galaxy 2 was that this was a blatant rehash of Galaxy's opening, and not only that, but a stripped-down and emotionally empty rehash. In Galaxy, actually in all previous 3D Mario games, the beginning takes place in a large open area where you can bounce around to your heart's content, familiarizing yourself with the controls before the game throws any kind of challenge at you. As simple a touch as this is, it's essential. There's a reason that Shigeru Miyamoto brings up the courtyard in front of Peach's castle in almost every interview he's given about Super Mario 64. Galaxy's version of this is a stroll through Toad Town during the only once per century Star Festival, a joyous celebration marked by a continuous shower of confetti-like star bits from the night sky. Mario is making his way to the castle for a rendezvous with Peach, but on the way there, the festivities are rudely interrupted by a full-scale invasion of the Mushroom Kingdom by Bowser and his minions, sailing through the skies in flying ships, accompanied by a huge mothership-style UFO. Bowser's ship flies right up to the battlements of Peach's castle, where Peach waits apprehensively, holding onto a strange star-shaped creature. Bowser taunts her and declares his intention to remake the entire galaxy in his own image, then uses the UFO to abduct not just Peach, but her entire castle and carry it away with him. Mario leaps onto the castle just before it lifts off, but he's disoriented by the sudden ascent and gets picked off by Kamek. Defeated and dazed, he passes out as his body drifts into the atmosphere. All this takes place before the first proper level of the game, which is not the first mission of the Good Egg Galaxy, but rather a unique set piece not associated with a specific galaxy, in which the Lumas help Mario catch up with the rearguard of Bowser's invasion fleet as it speeds away from the Mushroom Kingdom. Mario manages to find a strange machine which Bowser is using to extract energy from one of the special Grand Stars of the Comet Observatory, shuts the machine down, and returns to the observatory with the Grand Star in tow. Most of what I've just mentioned is gameplay, not cutscenes, but it's a form of gameplay that's very dramatic and emotional. If you take a moment to think about what's going on here, the stakes are actually quite high. Mario has failed to rescue Peach. She's being taken away from him at the rate of potentially tens of thousands of miles an hour, and his only hope of finding her is a space station that currently lacks power, meaning it can't even move. That power is in the form of Grand Stars, but Bowser has all the Grand Stars, and he's taking them along with him as he flies toward the center of the universe. Forget that this is just a Mario game for a second, and consider it as a story. If Mario fails in this first mission, if any one of several links in the chain that propels him toward that closest Grand Star fails, he's doomed, and so is the rest of the universe. In Super Mario 64 and Super Mario Sunshine, while there is a fixed first mission to play through, you could imagine that if that didn't work out, Mario could realistically find some other Power Star or Shine Sprite to make a start toward solving the central problem. That is not the case here. He needs this specific Grand Star. Now let's look at Super Mario Galaxy 2's opening. While Galaxy had a brief introductory cutscene that resembled a storybook, Galaxy 2's first moments of gameplay take place inside a storybook frame. The most important implication of this is that the beginning of the game confines your movement to 2 dimensions, for reasons that I honestly cannot fathom, because it deprives you of an opportunity to get comfortable with Mario's 3D movement without really adding anything to either the story or the gameplay. It's possible that this is a nostalgic reference to Mario's 2D roots, as recently seen in the new Super Mario Bros. Series, but why start a brand new experience with this winking in-joke? Was it some attempt at synergy between Super Mario Galaxy 2 and New Super Mario Bros. Wii? Or is this the developer's way of letting the cat out of the bag right off the bat that Super Mario Galaxy 2 would end up having way more restrictive 2D segments than Galaxy did? Well, it doesn't do to dwell on these things. Let's move on. Super Mario Galaxy 2 begins during the only once per century Star Festival, a joyous celebration marked by a continuous shower of star bits from the daytime sky? Yeah, so in this game the Star Festival is being held during the day, when you can't see any stars because the sun is out. Also, the Toads aren't celebrating in Toad Town because who would want to hold a party inside the place where they live? No, these Toads are just chilling out in the hills outside the town, which would admittedly be a good place to see stars, if you could actually see them. As he walks along, Mario runs across a Luma who's slammed into the ground like a starbit. The Luma wakes up, seems to take a shine to Mario without Mario actually doing anything, and then goes to live in his hat and allow Mario to spin, just like in the first game. Mario then enters Toad Town and instantly sees a giant Bowser stomping around. Bowser jumps in front of Mario, reveals that he has already kidnapped Peach, taunts Mario, points out, rather redundantly, that he has indeed become very large. This detail's never explained, by the way. And then he just flies off. He doesn't make any effort to, attack Mario. Since at his current size, he could probably squish him like a bug. Nope, he just flies off. And none of his minions are there for some reason. A couple of Lumas, who are around, instantly know that Bowser is taking Peach to the center of the universe, and they invite Mario to use their power to chase after him. Mario is then thrown into the first mission of the first galaxy. So apparently a single launch star can now hurl Mario across the same distance he used to need a spaceship to cover. That's good to know. Also, there's no unique introductory set piece here. The first mission is basically just a remixed Good Egg Galaxy, complete with the new type Dino Piranha boss battle at the end of it. After retrieving a single power star, Mario then lands on a medium-sized planetoid. No explanation of why he lands there instead of returning to the mission select screen for the Sky Station Galaxy, but again, whatever. He runs into a crew of Lumas and their burbly captain Lubba, who tells him that Bowser attacked their ship and stole all the power stars it needs to function. Lubba strikes a bargain with Mario. He gets their power stars back, and in return, they'll let him use their ship, which the Luma crew remodels into a giant facsimile of Mario's head using the power star Mario just got. From this point onward, the story, such as it is, follows a familiar Mario pattern that was also present in Galaxy. Mario obtains more collectibles, the collectibles allow the ship to move farther, which opens up new missions, and eventually Mario makes his way to where Bowser is waiting at the end. And that's all there is. Now you might come back at me and say that Galaxy had a simplistic story too, and I would agree with that. But the difference is that the story in Galaxy actually makes sense and has stakes. When things happen in Galaxy, they're set up, at least to some extent, while in Galaxy 2, they just happen, for seemingly no in-universe reason. For example, the way the Toad Brigade forms in Galaxy is that 5 assorted Toads escape from Bowser's clutches and are found by Mario in the Honey Hive Galaxy. They then go back with him to the Comet Observatory, where the Lumas help them build their own little spaceship, so they can help Mario find power stars. This is a really simple plot development, but it does at least proceed in steps. Mario finds the Toads, they explain what happened to them, they go back to the observatory, and then they build a ship. From that point on, they're recurring characters who serve as helpers and comic relief, and they're a valuable addition to the story. In Galaxy 2, by contrast, you're going through Spin Dig Galaxy in the first world when a launch star lands you on top of the Toad Brigade's starship, where Captain Toad introduces himself. That's it. There's no progression here. You don't rescue the Toads, it doesn't take time for them to build a ship, they just have everything already and show up partway through a level right before the boss. Now, having the Toad Brigade show back up fully formed would make sense if these were the same characters who first appeared in Galaxy. In other words, if Galaxy 2 was a sequel to Galaxy in every respect, including the story. But it isn't. Galaxy 2 is a lot closer to what movie people call a soft reboot, a retelling of the original game with remixed elements. This is very convenient for the designers, since they can just piggyback off of an existing story. But it also means that to be narratively satisfying, it would need to explain things like where the Toad Brigade comes from all over again, and it doesn't. The same is true for Mario's bigger little brother Luigi. In Galaxy, Captain Toad explains when you first meet him that they escaped from Bowser along with Luigi, but later they got separated. Ultimately, Mario finds him trapped in a haunted house within the ghostly galaxy, and after he's rescued, he goes on his own expeditions to find power stars, which usually end in him becoming trapped somewhere in increasingly silly ways. Meanwhile, in Galaxy 2, Luigi doesn't even have a fixed point where he appears. At some point he just starts showing up at the beginning of various levels, offering to take Mario's place for a while. No explanation of how he got there, or where he was when the story began, or what he's been doing with himself all this time. No little chit-chat about Peach being kidnapped, which, based solely on what he says, he might not even realize has happened. Or even just, hey, it's good to see you, Mario. He just immediately leaps into, do you want to let me play, bro, huh? Do ya? But I know that to some people, this is all entirely beside the point. Of course the story sucks. It's a Mario game, and a Mario direct sequel to boot. Mario games can have good stories, even if they're usually small ones, but no Mario game has ever lived or died on the quality of its story. Super Mario Sunshine is a game where things often just happen out of nowhere, and I love that game. So what really is my problem with Super Mario Galaxy 2? Well, to sum it up in one word, it's what most people consider the best part of Galaxy 2. Gameplay. But let me briefly connect these two disparate halves together by discussing what lies between them, which is to say level aesthetics and the related arena of level design. I am far from the first person to notice that, for a game set in space and containing the word Galaxy in its title, Super Mario Galaxy 2 is not a particularly spacey game aesthetically. The game box, title screen, opening, and first world map prominently feature a bright blue sunny sky that notably contrasts with Galaxy's use of dark nighttime settings filled with starry pinpoints. That's not to say there were no sunny galaxies in the original, but they're far more common in the sequel, to the point of becoming monotonous, especially since every Mario game has had bright and cheery levels, and the space aesthetic is one of the few things that make the Galaxy games unique. Of Galaxy's 37 main levels, excluding the Gateway, Planet of Trials, and the Grand Finale, 22 of them, nearly 2/3, appear to take place at night, while only 10 feature a bright blue sky, and another 5 have some other kind of backdrop, like lava or the cartoonish look of the Toy Time Galaxy. If we leave out the Grandmaster Galaxy from Galaxy 2, it has 48 main levels, and their backdrops are as follows: 23 nighttime levels, though I'm being generous with this, you could put it as low as 20, 22 daytime levels, and 3 that don't fit into either side. On top of this, the second game has a dozen or more missions which take place primarily inside a building, which doesn't feel like day or night, but more importantly, doesn't feel at all like being in space. Galaxy 2 overall has a problem, and yes, I do think this is a problem, of throwing you into a lot of restrictive 2D or 2D-esque set pieces, in which the level design and Mario's movement feel more akin to the new Super Mario Bros. Series than it does to previous 3D Mario games. I don't hate all of these segments. In fact, some, like the one in the Cosmic Cove Galaxy, are among my favorite parts of the game. But there's so many of them that after you've played the game for 4 or 5 hours, they start to grate, and they make the world feel even less natural and coherent than the eclectic level design already does. In Galaxy 2, going into a pipe on top of a spaceship no longer feels like you're really going into the innards of the ship. It feels like what it is, a separate level that you're being loaded into, and then after you go through another pipe, you get teleported somewhere else. My favorite galaxies in this game are the ones where you spend the most time out in the open, roaming over the surface of planetoids to find puzzle solutions and fight enemies. Places like the Puzzle Plank Galaxy, the Space Storm Galaxy, and the Freezy Flake Galaxy. These, to me, are the places where the team's boundless creativity made Galaxy-style exploration fresh, without losing sight of Galaxy's unique atmosphere. But for every level like this in Galaxy 2, there's at least one more that features contrived mechanics and tedious challenges that drive me crazy. The rock power-up takes you from the classic Mario moveset to playing a high-speed game of Super Monkey Ball for as long as you use it, and that practically ruined the Boulder Bowl Galaxy for me, along with the second mission of Melty Monster Galaxy. The Supermassive Galaxy has a bonus star that requires you to replay about 80% of what is already a long and taxing level, with no changes, and then you have to do the whole thing again for the Prankster Comet. The Battle Belt Galaxy is a boring succession of enemy encounters that's too easy the first time and insufferably hard on the Daredevil run. And the Purple Coin Challenge in the Flip Swap Galaxy takes a level that's normally fun and interesting because of how flexible it is, and forces you to traverse it in the slowest and most boring way imaginable. The obvious rebuttal to these complaints is that you don't have to do all this stuff if you don't like it. But that's less true of Galaxy 2 than it is of any previous 3D Mario game besides Super Mario Sunshine. Super Mario 64 had the same unlock condition for the final boss as Super Mario Galaxy 2, collect 70 Power Stars. But in Super Mario 64, you had access to every star in the game by the time you reached that final door, so this represented less than 60% of the missions that you could do. In the first Galaxy, on the other hand, you could only get about 105 of the game's stars before the final confrontation with Bowser, and the rest was post-game content. However, the criterion for unlocking the last level was reduced to 60, meaning you had to do slightly less of the available missions than what you had to do in Super Mario 64. But Super Mario Galaxy 2 ups the ante back to 70 stars, while at the same time it locks some of its content up for the post-game. Again, you have access to about 105 of the stars before fighting Bowser, so you have to do roughly 10% more of the content available to you than you did in Galaxy. Maybe that doesn't seem like a big difference to you, but I can tell you that whether this is fair or not, it made a big difference in my personal enjoyment of these two games. The original Galaxy was right on the edge when it came to how much of the game I really enjoyed playing versus how much it demanded that I do. I'm not saying I wouldn't have beaten the game if the limit had been, say, 70 stars, but in doing some of those required missions, I wouldn't have been having much fun. I'd have to grit my teeth and beat the level anyway for the sake of unlocking content I actually enjoyed. And that's what Galaxy 2 forced me to do, repeatedly. I would get to the end of a world, find that I didn't have enough stars to proceed, then look back at 2 previous missions which I had skipped, both of which I still didn't want to do, and calculate which one was going to be less irritating. To Galaxy 2's credit, a couple of times this led me to play a level that turned out to be surprisingly easy once it clicked, or surprisingly fun, or both. If that had happened every time I was forced to backtrack, I would be congratulating the map designers right now for their cleverness in getting me to overcome my first impressions. That's probably what they were going for by having the map work in this way. But for me, it didn't even happen the majority of the time, or anywhere close to the majority. So if you really like Super Mario Galaxy 2, I get that. If you think it's better than the original Galaxy, I get that too. It just means that you don't care about stories in video games, you enjoyed most of the new mechanics introduced, and you value diversity above coherence when it comes to theming. I would expect most people who are fans of Mario platformers specifically to feel that way. But the thing about Mario is that over the years it's attracted tens of millions of players, and if you look into what people say about the 2 Galaxy games, you'll find more than a few who feel about them the way I do, who responded emotionally to the approach taken by Galaxy and were left cold by Galaxy 2, regardless of any mechanical refinements. The last star I got in Super Mario Galaxy 2 before turning the game off was from the first mission in the Mario Squared Galaxy, Make Mario a Star, and this mission serves as a handy metaphor for the entirety of Galaxy 2's approach. In it, you travel across an odd planetoid which first appeared in the previous game's Toy Time Galaxy, shaped like Mario's 8-bit game sprite but made out of special platforms, originally rotating panels, and now flip-switch panels which you have to activate to get the star. It's a classic, short but sweet mission of the kind that Super Mario Galaxy 2 has dozens of. It's open-ended and entirely based on platforming, giving you the freedom to either be careful or show off your stuff depending on what you want out of the challenge. It's a lot of fun mechanically, but as a concept it's tissue-thin and never really makes you think, on top of which it's an idea recycled from an earlier game with minimal alterations. To some people, levels like this are what Mario is supposed to be all about. To me, they feel empty and leave me wanting something more. Super Mario Galaxy 2 is not one of those Mario games that have a clear and obvious impact on the design of the games that came after. As both a direct sequel to a game that there weren't going to be any more sequels to, and a self-consciously experimental project, it was never going to be seen as a prototype for the next big thing, not even to the extent of, say, New Super Mario Bros. In 2006. Rather, like Super Mario Bros. 2 back in the late 80s, Galaxy 2 would have a sort of stealth influence on the future course of the Mario series, generating ideas that would be tinkered with, and maybe appear years later in a considerably altered form. Lubba, for instance, that pudgy, lovable ship captain who really doesn't do much when you get right down to it, was never a major character again, but when Rosalina pops up in spin-offs, it's not uncommon for Lubba to be part of her crew. And the Whittles, little tree people who bear a passing resemblance to the Japanese forest sprites called Kodama, also never hit the mainstream. A sad mistake in my opinion, but they did make it into a few Mario Party games years later. Nevertheless, Super Mario Galaxy 2 is not a serious contributor to the Mario lore book, deliberately so. There's barely a story, only a few new characters who are basically confined to this one game, and the bosses no longer speak at all except for Bowser, Bowser Jr., and the Womp King, oddly, although his spiel is just the same as in Super Mario 64. Galaxy 2 does feature the triumphant return of Yoshi after his absence from the original Galaxy, but it would be a stretch to call him a character here. The one noteworthy thing about Yoshi here isn't the beginning of anything, but the end of something. This is in fact the last mainline Mario game in which Yoshi speaks. Yeah, did you forget that Yoshi used to be able to talk? You're not alone. He's been mute for so long, except in the RPGs, which Nintendo barely makes anymore, that many people don't realize classic Yoshi spoke perfectly natural human language for more than a decade. Even I forgot that Yoshi talks in this game, so when you first meet him I was shocked, pleasantly shocked, to find him yapping about his captured friends, just like in Super Mario World. In terms of enemies and gameplay, if nothing else, Galaxy 2 is very much its father's son. There are lots of new and interesting enemies here, but the vast majority were left behind when Mario went in a more nostalgic direction with Super Mario 3D Land and its sequel. What these games do share with each other is a renewal of interest in some classic 2D Mario enemies that hadn't yet been translated into 3D, most notably the Hammer Bros and Boomerang Bros. There's one brand new enemy who returned in a single future game, the Fizzlet, a pesky purple blob that can melt into a puddle of pure electricity on demand. They're a fairly common enemy, and a memorable one, but far from the most challenging. Someone at Nintendo must have had a soft spot for them, though, because they showed back up in Super Mario 3D World, looking a bit worse for wear, but still just as much of a nuisance as ever. But game mechanics are what Galaxy 2 really focused on, and several of these would be repurposed for later Mario games. Beat blocks, which appear and disappear with musical rhythm in several stages, were a big hit in 3D Land and 3D World, as were flip-swap panels, which flip whenever the player spins. Obviously, this was changed to jumping in future games, since Mario doesn't spin in those. The Cosmic Spirit, which shows up to help you out if you die too many times, never showed up again in exactly this form. But Super Mario 3D Land had a helper function that was activated the same way. Future games would address this issue by just being easier to begin with, or letting you play as invincible characters, like Nabbit. And in a more abstract sense, there are power-ups, like the Dash Pepper, and mission types, like the ones where you fetch a Goomba or Top Man for the Gizmos, which seem to be clear inspirations for similar things in Odyssey, specifically the Rocket Flower, and the missions where you possess an enemy and bring it to the Bonitor Biologist. But if you look at trends in Mario, I think the area where Super Mario Galaxy 2 was most influential, albeit in an obscure way, is general design. Like Super Mario Galaxy, this game is defined in large part by its status as a compromise. But in this case, it's not a compromise between the approaches of previous 3D Mario games, like Galaxy was, but instead a compromise between the approach of Galaxy and that of New Super Mario Bros. The first two Mario games set in 3D were heavily based on exploring the environment of each world. Super Mario 64 expected you to spend upwards of half an hour in each painting world, and these worlds were complex and highly interactive to encourage immersion. Super Mario Sunshine pushed even harder in this direction, with only 7 main worlds, about half as many, and more content in each. But Super Mario Galaxy went in the opposite direction, with many of its levels being 10 to 15 minute snacks rather than full-course meals. And Super Mario Galaxy 2 is another leap in the direction of bite-siziness. Not only is a typical Galaxy now smaller, but you also tend to go through them faster, thanks to more streamlined level design and a lot of power-ups that either directly or indirectly increase your speed. Many of the levels are also now more lethal, leading to a higher level of challenge, but also more deaths that force you to repeat earlier sections of the level. This can have the paradoxical effect of making a Galaxy feel more repetitive, even when it's supposed to feel faster. Galaxy 2's approach to both level design and map structure, while neither was totally original, were the future for Mario, reappearing with only slight alterations in Super Mario 3D World, Super Mario Wonder, and even Super Mario Odyssey, despite Odyssey's self-conscious intent to be more like the earlier 3D Mario games. Another thing shared by Galaxy 2 and Odyssey is an absolute flood of collectibles that individually have very little value or meaning. Galaxy's levels weren't as detailed as Sunshine's, but it did still seem to be going for immersion most of the time. Galaxy 2, on the other hand, keeps trying to distract you all the time with piles of coins and 1-ups, most of which are completely useless to a normal player, particularly since there's no really serious punishment for getting a game over. Not only that, but every time you reboot the game, your 1-up counter is reset to 5, a Mario tradition that had long outlived its heyday by 2010, and the gameplay equivalent of an inflamed appendix. I've heard a few people criticize Odyssey for deflating the value of its power moons by strewing them all over the place and handing them out whenever you do anything, from defeating a major boss to scratching Toad's nose for him. Yet I've never seen anyone trace this collectible overload back to its source, which is pretty obvious in retrospect. Sunshine's blue coins. Nah, I'm just kidding. Sort of. I do actually think that it's Galaxy 2's practice of salting its levels with copious amounts of 1-ups, coin troves, and life mushrooms. Good God, are there too many life mushrooms in this game, that ultimately led to that superficially tempting but deeply flawed decision in Odyssey. When I go back to that interview that Satoru Iwata conducted with Miyamoto about the development of Super Mario Galaxy 2, the strangest thing about it to me is how much Miyamoto stressed the importance of resonance and the danger of Mario games becoming childish if the team wasn't careful. Because these are both pitfalls that I think Super Mario Galaxy 2 falls headlong into. It's a silly, childish game with no real story and no ability or even desire to hold on to your attention after you're done playing. It doesn't have any resonance to me, not even mechanically, because it has too many one-off gimmicks, and there's no essential through line that connects the whole game together, something you can point to and say, that is what Super Mario Galaxy 2 is all about. It's not like Galaxy was an incredibly mature or intricate story to begin with, but if it's right on the edge of being just an excuse to do more platforming, then Galaxy 2 is over the edge, in a world where story is nothing but an unwanted distraction. Nintendo didn't care about this story, and they were pretty sure you wouldn't either, so nobody does. And we would all see just what that meant for 3D Mario in the next mainline Mario game, which wadded story up into a little ball and flicked it straight into the trash to make way for what they assumed everyone really wanted. Pure, unbridled, constant, dizzying platforming action.